Okay, Shabbat Shalom. We're going to begin. Good morning, Rosalie. We're
Good
going to
morning.
begin with Deuteronomy 22, and I assume you can all read this. And who would like to begin?
I'll read.
Doug, you want to start? Oh,
Sure.
and then Alejandra can do the next one.
If you see your fellow Israelite ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to its owner. If they do not live near you, or if you do not know who owns it, take it home with you and keep it until they come looking for it. Then give it back. Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything else they have lost. Do not ignore it. If you see your fellow Israelite's donkey or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Help the owner get it to its feet. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. You may take the young, but be sure to let the mother go, so it may go well with you, and you will have a long life. When you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. Do not plant two kinds of seed in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. Do not plow with an ox and donkey yoked together. Do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. Make tassels on the four corners of the cloak you wear.
Okay, just in this very, very short passage, there are a lot of laws and interesting items. We're going to start with the handout, which hopefully everybody has, but here it is. So we're going to start with this business if you find somebody else's animal. So finders, keepers, losers, weepers. No. The Midrash relates the story of wayfarers who leave. Ooh, somebody is making a lot of noise. Could you guys? I'm gonna mute you guys. Can you mute yourselves, please, so that whoever's doing something else. There, I've muted you, Rosalie. Don't worry about it. Okay. So the Midrash relates the story of wayfarers who leave 2 measures of barley for safekeeping with Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. They travel on, leaving no word as to the anticipated date of their return. 7 long years pass, and the itinerants finally come calling on the rabbi. He leads them to a large granary filled with the pounds and pounds of barley produced from the original 2 measures. The rabbi has planted, harvested, and stored the grain as part of his sacred covenant with the men to safeguard their holdings. If you see your fellow's ox, etc. No finders, keepers, losers, weepers axiom at work here. The Torah and the rabbis take seriously the moral obligation upon each of us to ensure the safe return of lost or lent objects, even if the finder has to incur some cost or effort to store or maintain them until the rightful owner makes claim. So that's kind of an interesting concept there, right? That you are going to have to take care of whatever it is that somebody either has left with you or that you've found and make sure that it goes back to its rightful owner. No grabbing, no like, oh, I found this, therefore too bad for you. So, any thoughts about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was teaching kindergarten, I would take my glasses and throw them down on the ground, and then I would say, and then I'd say, well, you can have them. No, they're yours. To try to make sure they understood that something belonged to me, not to them. And I said, well, it's the same if you find someone's pencil, because they would fight over a pencil. Just because you found it doesn't mean it's yours.
And I believe also that like it says here, that there's all the granary is filled with more and more grain, that also belongs to the person. In other words, it's not just the original material, but whatever has developed from it. There are other examples of this in the Talmud of, I don't know, taking animals and they multiply or whatever. All of that belongs to the original owner. And even though you have gone to some cost to take care of all of this, you still have to give it back.
You don't have to just give back what they gave you, though. You have to give it all back.
I'm pretty sure you have to give the whole thing back. I can double check on that, but I'm pretty sure if my memory serves me, which it may not.
So, Rabbi, are there any rules then for the person who is getting back their
Other property? You mean, do they have to pay a reward for?
Yeah, I mean, are there any rules on that?
I don't know of any. That doesn't mean there aren't, but I don't know of any. And I can check on that too. Yeah, Lynn?
I remember I read somewhere that some exception to this would be if somebody comes forward to claim, but they can't prove it was theirs. Let's say if it had been advertised,
Yes.
publicly known that somebody's missing. If they can't prove that it was theirs, that the people give it back to them or give it to them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there are also stories about people who both claim something, and it's, the person who has it often, that ends up being able to keep it. But possession is is 90% of ownership or something like that. What's that expression?
9/10 of the law.
So now we're going to read about some other stuff, but there are a couple of interesting pieces that I don't have the commentary for, which is, for example, the business about if you see a nest, you cannot take the baby birds along, when the mother is present. So it's like there's a certain amount of compassion for animals. There's a story in the Talmud about a kid who actually does exactly that and then falls from the tree and dies. And the rabbi who sees this just says, I can't believe in God anymore. This is just too horrible. So it's a tough one, but I think there's a certain amount of compassion. It doesn't mean that we don't take the baby chicks in the end, but at least we don't force the mother to witness it. So sort of a compromise between not taking them at all and taking them. And then there's a business about not wearing clothing that is clothing for a man,
That
if you're a
seemed
woman,
kind
and vice.
that kind of seemed out of place.
Well, you
It
know
was-
what? Actually, it ends with this whole business about not mixing, right? I mean, again, you have to remember, this is the priests of our tradition who are very, very concerned with everything being in its place. So they're the ones who wrote the first story of creation. Dry land and water separate. Darkness and light separate. You cannot mix things. You cannot mix different kinds of seeds. You can't mix linen and wool because linen comes from plants. Wool comes from animals.
From an animal.
And you can't yoke two different kinds of animals. It's interesting right now, there's something called Daf Yomi, which is people around the world study a page of Talmud every day for like 7.5 years. And I'm not reading a whole page every day because that's beyond my my capacity, time-wise and mentally. But I am reading a summary every day, which is, I think, from My Jewish Learning. And right now they are actually dealing with this whole business of mixing seeds and mixing different things. And so the whole discussion is around, if you have a plot of land, can you put different kinds of, vegetables or whatever in the same plot? So they're talking about how you can put, different ones on each side of the square and a different one in the middle. And, there's a whole discussion about this. So they're very concerned with this sort of thing. That's one of the ways that they try to maintain holiness in the community. I can't say that it really makes a lot of sense to me, but I think it is the origin of obsessive compulsive disorder. Yeah.
I've always thought that the point was just awareness. It was just, it wasn't that something bad is going to happen to your clothing if you mix those two things.
Right.
It's that you're supposed to be conscientious about everything you do because you're capable of it, and that's the way that you are if you're paying attention to things like that, you'll pay attention to your behavior in a lot of other ways. So I always thought these details are only there to draw your attention to all the things in the world that you could be paying attention to. And if you're paying attention to everything with that fine a detail, you're going to probably be very aware of your behavior too, because you're focused on everything. So I don't take the details as much as the concept, you know?
Yeah, and today of the Daf Yomi is farming is both physical and spiritual. So maybe all these laws are joining the physical and the spiritual to make you.
I think that is the idea. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's the idea. And so let me just read a couple of things from this Torah commentary about what we just looked at. So the verses about returning your fellow's ox, answering questions that must have arisen about implementing it. What is to be done if the owner is distant or unknown? Does this law apply only to the animals named or to other animals and inanimate objects as well? Questions and answers such as these initiated the legal discussion that is continued in the Talmud, of course. Tractate Bava Metzia, which discusses the finder's and the owner's responsibilities and distinguishes between things that the finder must try to return and those he may keep. So I'm going to look this up and let you guys know what some of the rulings are about this. So it says, until your fellow claims it, according to the halacha, the Jewish law, the finder must publicize what he has found and the owner must prove it is his by describing its identifying marks. And give it back to him. The law had to anticipate attempts by people to keep what they found. So Exodus and Leviticus deal with situations where the finder refuses to return the property, claiming that it is his or that he does not have it. And there apparently were ancient Near Eastern laws about this as well. Okay. Now, the one about not wearing clothing of the opposite sex. Several plausible reasons have been suggested for this commandment. Some think that it's directed against disguising oneself as a member of the opposite sex, since this would facilitate mingling with them and hence fornication. And unfortunately, this is the kind of argument people make about bathrooms for kids, for example, who are transgender. Oh, you know, they're going to go in a different bathroom and somebody's going to rape them, or, you know. But that apparently is what concerned these guys too. Others think that transvestism is inherently abhorrent, either because it blurs the sexual differences that God created, because it is a perverse means of sexual stimulation or homosexual role-playing, or because it was part of certain pagan rites and magical practices. Pertinent to the suggestion that it was a pagan practice is a Babylonian adage, according to which a person who is apparently an Amorite says to his wife, "You be the man and I'll be the woman," but there's no indication of what act this refers to. Don't forget that poor old Lilith was kicked out of the garden because she wouldn't lie under Adam. Okay. All right. So then we have the laws about the parapet.
Where did that go?
Oh yes, Jason, go ahead.
Just a practical way of thinking about that one too is that there are certain mitzvot that are incumbent upon men and certain upon women, and that you are supposed to be watching out for your fellows. And so if you could not tell who the person was, you might not be able to tell if they were actually being observant if they were not dressed in the clothing you would expect. And so it's all just about making everybody be as, you know, as focused on the behavior as possible, right? I mean, just from a practical matter, if I don't know that that's a man, then I can't necessarily expect him to do what he's supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And you might go into somebody else's bathroom and rape them. Okay, so I just want this. The Eitz Chaim has the halacha for some of this. So take it back to your fellow. This is back to the lost objects. Anyone who finds a lost object or animal without trying to return it to its owner is considered a thief. The finder must make a public announcement seeking the owner and is responsible for the object or animal until it is returned to its rightful owner. In other words, you can't just, you know, stick it in your backyard and ignore it. You know, if it's an animal, you have to take care of it. The claimant must be able to describe the items, identifying signs, or provide evidence of ownership. Lacking identifying marks, lost property found in a public place, or appearing to be abandoned is considered ownerless. There is also that law about ownerless objects that are just, clearly, whoever had it doesn't care or whatever. How you make that distinction, not always easy. And then the one about man's apparel, this is again the halacha. The Torah's prohibition on cross-gender dressing, in which a man would try to pass as a woman or a woman as a man, does not prohibit women from wearing long pants or shorts, which the fashion of the times considers as acceptable apparel for both men and women. So that's kind of nice. You don't have to worry about wearing pants. And then the one about do not take the mother with her young, the compassion demanded for the mother bird here is one of the Torah passages that led the sages to formulate the general principle that we must avoid causing unnecessary pain to animals, which is why theoretically the way we slaughter animals is supposed to be humane by doing a quick cut of the throat. Other biblical verses expressing this value include, okay. Any other comments before we go to the parapet?
Yes, Rabbi, do they have a time limit if you find a lost animal? Is there a time limit in when you can keep it after you've publicized that you
I
have?
don't know. I'm going to look this up.
Because I would think there would be something. I mean, this
You would
can't go
think-
on forever.
It could. You could come back 20 years later and say,
Really?
hi, that's my, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to look this up and I will email you guys what I find.
I also think that this particular explanation that you just read by Judy Shanks, I think it's a very good rebuttal.
Okay, excuse me, muting people. Okay. Okay, somebody else. Oh, thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes it
Wraps around each other.
Yeah. So everybody has to keep.
I think it's a good rebuttal. This thing about taking 2 measures of barley, safeguarding them, putting them to use, and then returning the entire thing. It's a fantastic rebuttal to, we're usurious, we're stingy, we're greedy, we're manipulative, et cetera, et cetera.
It's it's a nice idea that even though you're going to spend money and time taking care of somebody else's property, it's still theirs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have finders, keepers, losers, weepers.
Right.
In our society, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why she uses that to say this is like really different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why are these all together in one chunk of laws? There are a lot of laws. I think this Torah portion is the one that has the most laws in it.
It does.
The Torah portion.
Yeah. That's what it says.
So, yeah. Why are they all like bundled together here? I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I think your original explanation is the best about this separation,
Right.
not mixing things, being very clear. It reminds me of kashrut. I mean, as Jason said, you have to be very mindful of what you're doing. It's one of the ways that we, in the modern world, can show, if just to ourselves, that we're Jewish.
But I mean, the one about returning lost objects, I guess that's, if it belongs to you, it's yours. If it, just because I find it, it's not mine. I guess that's another kind of separation. And the baby birds, I mean, you're separating them from their mother. So I guess the idea is to be compassionate when you do it.
And it also said in the Torah portion, though, that they are the future generation of birds. I mean, you're going to get more from these birds because they're going to produce other birds.
I mean, unfortunately, it makes me think of something I read the other day, which is not the first time I've read it, but about veal. Because what they do is they rip the calves away from their mothers and the mothers wail.
That's
And
why I
just-
don't eat veal.
Right. I haven't eaten veal in years, but it just, just thinking about that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing about mindfulness is that, we don't always think about, okay, we're eating something. We don't think about what leads to that particular piece of food. Or we wear clothing. Do we think about where it comes from? I mean, my wonderful mentor, Rabbi Richard Levy, talked about, well, okay, we're not going to worry about kilayim now, which is the mixing of, wool and linen or any of those kinds of mixing, but we can apply it in a modern sense if we look at the labels of our clothing and think about what went into making that clothing. Bangladesh, where a lot of our clothing is made, we already know from what happened a few years ago, and I'm sure it's still happening, that collapse of a factory that burned down, just like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Unfortunately, the conditions there are bad and allows for us to have cheaper clothing. And a lot of our comforts as privileged people come on the backs of people who are not so comfortable. Yeah, Jason.
Well, I remember you'll be glad to know, I remember, you gave a sermon about the minerals that are used in technology and how they're often mined in slave conditions in countries without, with all sorts of problems.
Thank you.
And, these are the kinds of things that if you want to be mindful about everything you do and you take the time, you can actually do them, right? I mean, that is sort of the modern equivalent, right?
Yeah,
Right. If you look at everything you're going to use with intent, I mean, it's work, but then again, so was making sure these other things got followed in ancient times, right? It's available to us if you want to do it, I guess.
Right.
Is the point.
And even just the whole environmental disaster that we're creating. I mean, we thought the world was endless in terms of resources, in terms of our ability to throw out waste. And now good morning, Susie.
Good morning.
And now we're discovering that, the earth is not limitless and that, we have just been, blissfully unaware or purposefully unaware of what we're doing. Now we know, and we've known actually since at least 30 years or 40 years that, we need to hold back more, but we're not necessarily doing it, unfortunately. So yeah, I think this does cultivate mindfulness and awareness, and hopefully it can extend beyond, is my clothing linen and wool or whatever, to what's the larger picture here that I'm part of. Okay, so Susie, we're reading Deuteronomy 22, which but we're going to go back to some commentary here on the parapet. So, as I said, it contains the most laws of any Torah portion, 74, and that's more than 1/10 of all the laws in the Torah. But it's also a good reminder that for the development of the halacha, biblical law was just a building block. For example, the somewhat confusing law that one must place a parapet on one's roof not only becomes the basis of the Jewish equivalent of OSHA, which is Occupational Health and Safety Administration regulations, but also is used by more contemporary authorities to develop a Jewish legal objection to secondhand smoke. So, I'm sorry, did somebody? Okay, so the idea here is you build a parapet on your roof because somebody might fall off, right? Now, is it your problem that somebody is dumb enough to go up on the roof and not take precautions? Yes. You are responsible for making sure that person doesn't fall off, or at least to do your best to make sure, right?
Is that like it's your responsibility to put a fence around your swimming pool
Yes, definitely, definitely.
to
And
protect?
it's the reason for the those caps on medication. They're really hard to take off. I mean, you are responsible if a child goes into your medicine cabinet or goes into the cabinet under the sink.
Right.
All of that stuff. We've adopted all of this into
Yes,
the
and-
modern world.
Right. Well, also in in Exodus, in one of the laws of Mishpatim, which is Asher's Torah portion, it says that if you are If you have a fire in your backyard and a spark goes off into your neighbor's yard and starts a fire, you're responsible for that. So, you know, yes, Lynn.
I'd read a commentary somewhere on the roof that makes it a little more relevant, that in those times that they were flat and they were used as almost outdoor living spaces. So it wasn't unexpected for people to be up there, you know, like we might think right now.
Yeah.
They used to sleep, Lynn, they used to sleep on the roof in the summer because it's so hot inside.
Right. Yeah. So it's not like now where you don't expect somebody up there.
Although we know people who have gone up on their roofs and fallen.
Yeah.
Many
Right.
people.
Yeah.
And their parapet is kind of hard for a sloped roof.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the roofs were flat and people slept up there, fine. But you know, you have to take some precautions so they don't slip off in the middle of the night or start sleepwalking. I have some more on this though.
Okay.
Okay, so Parshat Ki Tetzeh offers, and by the way, Ki Tetzeh is when you go, you know, when you take the field against your enemies. That you know, as you go into the, as you're going into the promised land, etc. And then we find out what the rules are in the new community. Anyway, offers one of the first instances of building code in human history. The precursor to restrictions on asbestos insulation and circuit breaker requirements. At a moment in time when houses had flat roofs, as you said, Lynn, the Torah tells us when you build a new house, etc. It's a simple principle. A flat roof where family and friends might hang out and barbecue is an inherently dangerous place. We should anticipate that danger and build a railing so no one falls. This is an intuitive proposition, but we shouldn't fail to note one innovative implication. The parapet requirement provides a practical application of the more abstract principle of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Beyond demanding that we not perpetrate sins of commission against one another, the Torah now concretely prohibits a sin of omission. It's not enough for us simply to refrain from pushing someone off a roof. We must anticipate and proactively protect against that danger. It's not an especially radical leap to apply the principle more generally. If we could easily foresee that something we own may cause danger, we should take precautionary action to mitigate the danger. It's in the spirit of this verse that American law has seen fit to regulate some of the most mundane details of home ownership. Homeowners must clear their sidewalks of ice and snow so postal workers won't slip and fall. And here's yours, Sandy. Swimming pool owners are required to cover their pools when they're not in use to prevent wandering children from falling in and drowning.
That's right.
And in many jurisdictions, it is unlawful to dispose of a refrigerator without first removing the door. Children have suffocated while playing in discarded refrigerators. These are sensible precautions and represent a reasonable approach to assigning responsibility and accountability. The Rambam, Maimonides, however, expands the principle dramatically. In his legal commentary on this verse, he writes, both the roof and any other object of potential danger by which it is likely that a person could be fatally injured require that the owner take action, just as the Torah commands us to make a fence on the roof, and so too regarding any obstacle which could cause mortal danger. One, not just the owner has a positive commandment to remove it. If one does not remove it, but leaves those obstacles constituting potential danger, one transgresses a positive commandment and negates a negative commandment. Thou shalt not spill blood. Here the Rambam builds upon the radical step already taken by the Torah. In addition to being responsible for acts of omission as well as commission, we are now responsible not only for our own property, but any other object of potential danger. Our universe of obligation now encompasses everyone, even people we can't see, and we are bound to anticipate potential dangers and preemptively protect people against them. So now it's a much wider area of responsibility. Poverty, violence, disease, hunger. Interesting when you think about disease, right? That's the whole issue about masks, right? That you're wearing a mask not to protect yourself, but to protect other people from you. The potential applications of this principle are myriad. Take malaria, the most widespread of transmissible diseases in the world. Each year, malaria causes over 300 million acute illnesses and over 1 million deaths. In sub-Saharan Africa, the World Health Organization has documented a 20% decrease in child mortality among families that use insecticide-treated mosquito nets over their sleeping areas. By the Rambam's logic, a malarial mosquito seems a perfect extrapolation from an unfenced roof, and we should be bound to provide mosquito nets for all people living in regions affected by malaria. I mean, I think that's a bit of a stretch, even though I agree that we have some responsibility for it, but where would such responsibility end? If we take the principle to its logical extreme, we run the risk of being paralyzed by compassion fatigue, the feeling of our inadequacy measured against the overwhelming needs we face around the world. It can't be that the Torah and the Rambam would set us up for such an exercise in frustration. The tradition offers a couple of solutions to this dilemma. First, in a well-known Talmudic passage, we read, "Whoever can prevent his household from committing a sin but does not is responsible for the sins of his household. If he can prevent his fellow citizens, he is responsible for the sins of his fellow citizens. If the whole world, he is responsible for the sins of the whole world." The one about citizens is really about taking some responsibility for making sure people vote for their interests, among other things. The key word here is can, efshar. If one can intervene only in one's household, that is the purview in which one is responsible. If, however, one can intervene globally, one's responsibility extends that far. The Talmud's assertion can be summed up by Uncle Ben's admonition to Peter Parker in Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. So as a powerful nation in the world, taking advantage of all sorts of resources, including, cheap labor, we have a responsibility to those other places in the world. Second, in response to a question about the extent of a person's obligation to save a human life, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach offers an alternate possibility. Rabbi Auerbach considers two situations. In the first, the questioner is the sole potential savior of a person at risk of dying. In the second, the questioner is one among many people who could intervene to save a life. He writes, as to what to do in our case, it looks to me certain that in a case such as this, where one sees his friend drowning in the river and there's no one to save him, sorry, I did not do these typos. It's the person who wrote this that did, but he has to spend all his resources to save him. But when the matter is publicly known to everyone, we rely on the lenient opinion, and one is not obligated to give more than his fair share. So if you're the only person who can save this person, you've got some responsibility. If you're not the only one, you do what you can, give your fair share.
That sounds a lot like that. The guy that was killed by the policeman with his knee on his neck, and there were 3 other policemen there that could have helped.
Yeah, exactly. And there were people screaming and yelling.
And they didn't do anything.
Well, it's hard to do something when there are cops there with guns, but they were at least trying to get the guy to stop. And they took pictures, which is one way of doing something. Maybe there'll be justice. I'm not terribly optimistic, but.
Well, they're trying to say now that there were he had health issues and things like that.
Yeah, well, that's why you don't stick your knee into his neck when he says he can't breathe. Okay, instead of assigning responsibility in proportion to power, Rabbi Auerbach imposes a flat tax approach to responsibility. Everyone has a fair share, presumably based on the distributed allocation of need among all the people capable of contributing. When we look at the world, at all the roofs left unguarded, all the dangers that imperil people, the implications are daunting. And this was written right before the high holidays. So he says the question of how much responsibility each one of us bears becomes paramount. We must think deeply about whether we have acted to prevent others' wrongdoing, and we must begin the work of constructing parapets, of institutionalizing precautions against destruction, willful or accidental. It's hard work, but if we truly want to avoid standing idly by the blood of our neighbor, it must be done. So actually, bringing up the issue of George Floyd, what's our responsibility in terms of that case? We're not people who are actually right there, but do we have a responsibility in another way?
Well, the rioters think it's their responsibility to protest violently. Is that true? Is that
Well, I
right?
think that, I mean, I heard that there's some outside agitators coming in, possibly some people sent by Russia, who knows? At the same time, the anger that the Black community feels, I think, is completely justified. I mean, how many Black people have to be killed by the police before? So the question I'm asking is, do we have a responsibility in this matter? What is our responsibility out here? Yeah, Jason.
It's not just Black people who are outraged. I mean, I'm outraged that it's done in the name of anyone white. I mean, that to me is as offensive that people think that that's okay
Right.
because of that. On the other flip side of it, I mean, that all those people would watch. But no, I'm struck by this idea of the communal responsibility, because I think there's a famous experiment, right, where they stage an assault like in the courtyard of a building, and all these people are watching, but nobody calls the police, right?
Oh, that's not an experiment. That was a real story.
Oh,
Yeah.
that was okay.
Kitty Genovese.
Yeah.
So then I guess, okay, yeah, things.
That was a
become-
real story where people didn't do anything because everyone thought someone else was, going to do it, or they were scared, or they didn't want to get involved, or whatever it was.
So you can't really absolve just because you think other people are also witnessing. You don't have to jump in and save the person. I mean, that part struck me as odd.
So what I'm asking though is, here we are in Riverside. That happened in Minneapolis. A lot of these, murders by police happen in other cities. But so what is our responsibility out here? We weren't witnessing it, but do we have a responsibility?
We do have a
We can write
responsibility
letters.
in our own communities.
Write
You know.
letters?
We can support that they do something.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think our responsibility is to do whatever we can to make sure that the so-called criminal justice system is a real justice system, I mean, and that, yes, Carol.
Yeah, and we can't forget that the media is portraying this as, look at these people, they're destroying their own community.
Yeah,
There's been a lot of comparisons to the Boston Tea Party when we had just had it and just rioted and went crazy. It's year after year after year of the same thing. And
Yeah.
that's why they're reacting like we do. Don't judge how they're reacting. If you trade places, you would have had it too.
Right.
And there are actual pictures of other instigators there breaking windows and stuff. So you got to look at the full picture.
well, as somebody was saying this morning, I was listening to CNN this morning, and somebody said, we talk about violence in terms of the response, but what about the violence that led to this? The violence on the part of the police, right? I mean, the police are the ones who, started this, really, right?
And,
I mean,
and Rabbi, as
yeah.
you and I were exchanging emails this week about our own law enforcement in our own county has not exactly been behaving well. And, so you talk about what we can do. Well, we actually have something closer to home to deal with our sheriff and his behavior.
Right.
So there's always something else too. And I guess and these incidents are just the ones we were, I hate to say fortunate, but we got to see them.
Right.
And it's the ones that are committed all the time that nobody sees, the ones that happen behind closed doors that are unfortunately probably more common. And
Yeah.
that's what leads to the simmering, is people know that these are just the ones we were actually able to witness.
Absolutely. It's interesting. When I worked at PBS, there was a little department of acquisitions, and I was at PBS in like the early 80s. Okay, so we're talking about, in those dollars, they bought a film for $40,000, which is a lot of money even then, but be worth a lot more today. And it was called Bronx Detectives. And it was a British film, actually, like BBC or something. And they followed Bronx detectives as they were going around in the Bronx, going into people's homes and arresting people and all that. And of course, the detectives were white and the people they were arresting were black. Now, yes, that in fact was what happened. It's not like they made it up. And the people who bought it were white, so it didn't even occur to them that there was an issue with this. Well, my colleague and friend Gail Christian, who is a black woman, was furious because she said this just feeds into the stereotypes of, black people being criminals and, being arrested and all this stuff. And she, really objected to it enough that they finally decided not to air it. But that's the kind of thing where we are, it wouldn't have occurred to me. It wouldn't have occurred to me. I would have thought, oh yeah, that's what these guys are doing. But yeah, it was feeding into the stereotype. Not to mention the fact that why are they going around arresting black people as opposed to white people for the same crimes and whatever, But I think, first of all, we need some awareness of, what's going on out there. And we need to protest. If you are able to protest and you don't, you are responsible, And whether it's writing letters, whether it's making sure people can vote, whatever it is. Protesting, going to a protest. I think we have a responsibility, and I think that's what our tradition teaches us, and that's what this material is really teaching us. Anyone else want to comment? Okay, so we're going to, and I got a couple of things in the chat. Teresa says, we do have a responsibility, but it's difficult to figure out what to do, and sometimes what we do doesn't seem very effective. Yeah. We don't have the same ability to accomplish things as people who have guns. Now the governor of Minnesota is talking about bringing in the army. I can't imagine how hideous that's going to end up being if that happens.
I think he got the idea from number 45.
Yeah, I'm sure 45 is, yeah. Well, as he said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Hey, let's, go to war. Okay. Alejandra, you want to pick it up here? Marriage violations.
Yeah, I have to put my face kind of close to read it.
Okay.
If a man takes a wife and, after sleeping with her, dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, but when I approach her, I did not find proof of her virginity, then the young woman's father and mother shall bring the town's elders at the gate proof that she was a virgin. Her father will say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, I did not find your daughter to be a virgin, but there is proof of my daughter's virginity. Then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the young woman's father, because this man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives.
So lovely, right? You get to stay with this creep, and the father gets paid because.
Does she get to divorce him?
No. Women cannot initiate divorces. Isn't that nice? And of course, the proof of virginity, this is so offensive, but as you probably know, when a woman gets married and she's a virgin and they have sex and there's blood on the sheet, that's the proof. And that's what the father has to bring to show, hey, look, she was a virgin. Who can prove that this was a sheet from the first night? Oh, well. But, okay, the way women are handled here is not so terrific. All right, let's share screen. All right, go back to this. Okay, let's keep going.
If, however, the charge is true, and no proof of the young woman's virginity can be found, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of the town shall stone her to death. She has done an outrageous thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil from among you. If
Nice.
a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, Both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel.
Let me just stop for 1 second. Notice it says if a man sleeps with another man's wife, not if a woman sleeps with another woman's husband, okay? Because adultery here is messing with somebody else's property. And the property here is the wife of the man, right? And so adultery doesn't matter if the man is married or not. Okay? Okay, next.
If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married and sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. For the man found the young woman out in the country, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to rescue her. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. A man is not to marry his father's wife. He must not dishonor his father's bed.
Okay, so again, note that the raping here, the problematic raping, is because she's betrothed. She's engaged to marry someone else. And the assumption is if she screams, that means she, is being raped. If she doesn't scream, she's not. Now just imagine you're being raped. Who said you could scream? I mean, you might be completely frozen solid, right? And not be able to scream. Or you might be terrified of screaming. So the assumption here is if she screams, she's being raped. If she doesn't scream, it means she's doing it because she wants to do it. Makes me almost think of, did you hear about this judge? Excuse me. I don't remember where he was. Just recently in last week's news, apparently there was a story about a woman being raped, and he asked the woman if she had closed her legs up to avoid the guy raping her. He was fired. But seriously, I mean, how did this guy ever become a judge? So these assumptions that we're making here are not ancient assumptions, they still resonate today. So if she's in a town and she doesn't scream, the assumption is she is doing it because she wants to, because otherwise she would have screamed and somebody would have heard her. If she's in a field, the assumption is that maybe nobody could have heard her. So that's a really, upsetting series of laws. And then of course, if a man, yeah.
Since we just were discussing before the obligation to respond to someone in need, if you hear a scream, you don't necessarily go running in our world. And one wonders what in that world, I mean, a scream can mean a lot of things, and you can't necessarily know that it meant that. So are we to go and barge into our neighbor's house every time we hear screaming? I mean, like, where is that modern obligation to be protective of people who need to be protected, but yet, this stuff gets, I mean, you could end up getting shot breaking into somebody's house because you heard them scream.
True.
I mean, it's right in our modern world. I don't even know how you will apply this in an effective way.
And I will, because I'm looking at this, the Eitz Chaim commentary. Let's see. So the halacha on this is the sages understood town and country metaphorically, distinguishing between instances in which the woman did not object and those in which she objected but was overcome. Now, how are they going to determine that? I mean, I think, because I was just going to say, I think the screaming issue is not so much an actual literal screaming, but somehow objection versus consent. But, We all know.
It
That's
sounds
fair.
it sounds kind of like recently there've been charges of, sex between, and then the guy says, oh, well, it was consensual.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. She said no, but she didn't mean it. So it's very tricky. Very, very tricky. The one about he seizes her and lies with her. Now, obviously, the idea that a guy rapes a woman and has to marry her is really offensive to us. On the other hand, you have to think about the context, which is if she's raped, damaged goods, nobody's going to marry her. So she gets to have as a lovely husband her rapist.
But he can also have another wife.
Plenty of other wives, yes.
Yes.
But at least he has to take care of her. So the halacha on that is rape is a crime punishable under rabbinic law as an offense against the woman and her family. Hello. Because obviously everything here is more about the father's honor than the woman's. While every sexual relationship should be respectful and by mutual consent, the Torah sees marriage as the ideal setting for sexual relations. Consensual sexual intercourse between singles is censured. So, as I said, if you're somebody else's property, watch out.
Well, Rabbi, you brought up honor, and I kind of wonder if it is honor or if it's just property. Like, is there really a concern for family honor in Jewish tradition, or is it really just about property rights? It's an interesting question.
Yeah. I do think honor is part of it. I mean, you hear about these honor killings in certain places still today, unfortunately.
Honor killings are common nowadays.
I'm sorry?
Honor killings in certain countries is still, standard practice.
It still happens. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because it's more of this kind of context. And even in less sort of primitive, kind of mores, I would say, you still have, people from certain cultures who, don't want their daughters to do whatever because it's going to reflect badly on the family, So it's not really considering a woman as an individual, independent person. Yeah.
So I was just going to say that just based on the previous thing that we read and now here where we are, it's all men. So it's all about sort of like the nature of men, right? Because they're like, what is a guy going to do? He sees a woman. That's sort of the assumption. And before we had all these laws about how to be sort of conscientious, how to be respectful. And then the next passage is like, well, if you see her, this is what happens. Sort of when I teach early America, the way it was sort of like, they were like, well, of course the Spanish came and raped women because what were they going to do? And you're like, no. You don't have to, this is not a normalized thing that happens, right? So you have to sort of tell your students, this is not, and this is what, when I read it here, I just see that assumption that like, well, what were they going to do? She was out in the field. And I was like, oh, especially before we had all those laws. It's just very interesting that it's sort of.
Yeah, good point, especially after we've just talked about being compassionate for birds.
Well, and remember last week, Alejandro, we were talking about when there was a siege of a town, it was expected that men would do things that they shouldn't do. And it was basically just, well, you're going to do that. So just do that and then come back and be behaving yourself when you get back.
Right. Exactly.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Just wondering.
Okay. Yeah, this is all very disturbing. And of course, the high priest is not allowed to marry anybody but a virgin, right? Nobody's been touched by another man, divorced. Oh. So that's part of their issue about purity.
But I guess you could argue too that, it's also realistic. This doesn't idealize people, or
True.
God even isn't idealized in the Torah. We are shown for all the horrible things that we're going to do. And we know as people are capable and will do. So it confronts reality with a perspective of trying to deal with them in ways that are consistent and under some kind of code. and as opposed to just sort of, idealizing that we're not going to do things that we shouldn't do.
Yeah. It's true. On the other hand, the assumptions that are made about women are not so great. But what are you going to do? That's how they...
No, I agree. It's certainly more male focused. There's no getting around that.
All right, so let's go on to the next part here, which is... Okay, who would like to read? These are it's just the same laws sometimes. Okay, Jason, you want to read?
Hasn't everyone heard my voice enough? Got to be someone else.
I'll read.
Okay, thank you, Sandy.
Let me put my glasses on. No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. No one born of a...
Can I just tell you what the this other translation, no one whose testes are crushed or whose member is cut off. Okay, let's be really explicit here. Okay.
No one born of a forbidden marriage, nor any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam, son of Beor from Pethor in Aram, to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. Do not despise an Edomite, for the Edomites are related to you. Do not despise an Egyptian, because you resided as foreigners in their country. The third generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord.
Okay. So remember, okay, Shavuot was just the last couple days, and we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, and where is Ruth from?
Moab.
Moab.
She's a
And
Moabite.
yet she's a Moabite, and yet she's accepted into the community. How do you explain that after seeing this
You
law?
said, didn't you say last night that it was only the men?
Well, that's what, so the rabbis always find ways to get around problems, like when Abraham goes to Egypt and he says to his wife, Sarah, tell them that you're my sister, which is clearly a lie. They say, well, actually, they have the same father and different mothers, so they're actually half brother and sister. Well, nowhere in the Torah does it say that. But they don't want him to be a liar, right? And so Ruth is the great-great-grandmother of somebody important. Remember who that is?
Yes.
King David, right? So how are you going to cast aspersions on her? So they say, well, Hebrew is a gendered language, right? There's masculine and feminine, and here it says no Moabite in the masculine, which is always the way, if you want to do a generalized statement, you will put it in the masculine. That's just how it is. So they said, well, it says no Moabite masculine, so that's why it's okay for her. Actually, the reason it's okay for her is because she's an extraordinary person, and as one of the kids said last night, don't judge people by their labels. Even though she's a Moabite, the Moabites really did not treat the Israelites well when they were going through the desert. The fact is, she's the epitome of chesed, of loving kindness. Anyhow, let's see what the commentary has to say about Moabite. Oh, Jason.
I find really problematic here that it basically gives license to discriminate against people many generations removed from even what was the supposed origin of the issue. And I find that pretty problematic because it's, we were having all these separations before, and here's another separation. These are the people you're allowed to discriminate against, these are the people you're not. And licensing that in the halacha is pretty troubling.
Absolutely. Now, by the way, in the third verse where it says no one misbegotten shall be admitted into the congregation, that's a mamzer, which kind of, I think people use that word kind of to mean bastard or whatever. It doesn't mean bastard. It just means somebody, like, you've had sex with somebody who's forbidden to you. Like, you're mother-in-law, or
Cousin.
whatever. Huh?
I was going to say first cousin, but that's not true.
Yeah, right. That's okay. But there's certain forbidden sexual relations. And if you have a child with that particular person, you are a mamzer. And by the way, in the Orthodox community, that is still, you're still labeled, if you're a mamzer now, you're always a mamzer, and you can only marry another mamzer. And your children are mamzers forever. So that's still practiced. Let's see, it says, according to Jewish law, this refers only to the offspring of adultery or incest, not to those born out of wedlock. The CJLS, which is the Committee of Jewish Law for the conservative movement, has adopted evidentiary procedures to render this rule inoperative because it penalizes children for the sins of their fathers, or their parents, I mean. That's in the conservative movement, because they still adhere to halacha. The Reform movement doesn't even consider this anything. But the conservatives find a way around it, and the Orthodox still follow it. All right, so let's look at the commentary on this. Okay, does somebody want to read?
The Orthodox are not stoning people to death, are they?
I'm sorry?
I presume the Orthodox are not stoning people to death, though.
No, no. So who would like? Okay, thank you.
No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of Adonai. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. Here the Torah's rhetoric seems unnecessarily emphatic and even cruel. Not only are these people to be kept out of our communal tent, their polluted blood defiles their children and their children's children for 10 generations forward. Not only are they to be excluded from our community, they are unworthy of even the meagerest human sympathy or concern. Deuteronomy here seems to suggest that the cost of our communal solidarity is our fierce and total rejection of others who are unlike us. Yet, only a few centuries later, this prohibition will be ignored in one of Judaism's greatest stories. Ruth is a Moabite, one of those who are categorically forbidden to enter our community. Yet she becomes the paradigmatic convert, choosing to stay with her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi, after the death of her husband, with these famous words, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." She binds her destiny with that of the Jewish people in outright defiance of the Torah's express prohibition. What's more, Ruth goes on to marry another Jewish man, Boaz, and with him inaugurate the line that will lead to King David, and through him, our tradition suggests, the Messiah. The Talmud attempts to rectify this conflict by suggesting that the original prohibition only applied to Ammonite and Moabite men, not women. This seems, however, to be a highly unlikely interpretation. Deuteronomy, in multiple places, expresses grave concerns about the risks posed by foreign women who might lead Israelite men astray. Given that context, there is simply no reason to assume that the Torah would specifically limit its prohibition to Moabite and Ammonite men. The conflict between Deuteronomy and Ruth is real and cannot be neatly resolved. The Bible does not speak with one voice. Instead, our sacred canon is rife with tensions between competing ideologies. Here we encounter a struggle between those that would exclude certain groups, not only from our community, but from our circle of care and concern, and those that say that it is precisely through their inclusion that the messianic redemption is made possible. As the debate is left unsolved in our text, the conversation continues to our own day. Will religion draw us closer, or will it serve as a wedge that keeps us apart?
And actually, I'm not going to get to this right now, but the book, okay, so in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth is in the section called Writings, but in the Christian Bible, it comes right next to the book of Judges, because supposedly Ruth occurs during the period of Judges and is in very marked contrast to what goes on in the book of Judges, where you have people behaving really hideously. And you have, the book of Ezra, where Ezra tells the people the men to divorce their non-Jewish wives. So you do have this conflict between accepting somebody into the community like Ruth and the, demand by Ezra that all the, Ezra comes back from Babylonia, and the Israelite men have married women who are not Israelites, and he demands that they divorce all of them. Now, it never says that they actually do it, so that gives you a little hope that maybe that was a sort of public statement. So sometimes you say, this is the law, but I don't see it if you're going to, go around it. Sometimes that happens. But yeah, there's definitely this definite tension in the Bible about that. Yeah, Jason.
Well, and I'm also not sure how to weigh this against things that we're taught all elsewhere about, love your neighbor as yourself, or kindness to a stranger, and all these things that you have are positive commandments that we're supposed to do that don't discriminate. And then here we're given this discrimination. I mean, nobody said the Torah is without contradictions, but it's a pretty, we talk fundamentally about love your neighbor as yourself as one of the central precepts. And then here we have another one basically telling us to ignore and not show any concern for certain human beings. And it's right after this piece about that you should care for the baby birds and the mother, and it's about compassion. So what's a person to do with all this?
Well, as I think I've mentioned, I had a professor whose name is Stephen Pasamanik, who was a tough bird, and he would get really annoyed because the Religious Action Center would have all these verses saying, oh, we should do this, that, the other thing, all these justice things. And for example, the Jewish tradition is against the death penalty. Well, guess what? There's all kinds of stuff that show you that it isn't. And so you can pick and choose, right? And that's a problem. One really smart modern Orthodox rabbi that I studied with suggested that rather than trying to do this kind of cherry picking of verses that support your position, that you look at the process by which the rabbis, let's say in the Talmud, come up with a decision. So, for example, he suggested that in the debate about, let's say, abortion, to look at, there was a discussion about, I don't remember, it was Hillel and Shammai, or two different schools that completely disagreed about how to handle a particular, I think it was something about if you left someone in the forest and they get eaten by a bear, are you liable for murder or something like that? And he said, they have different opinions about it, so they decided each group would follow what was right for them. So why don't we do the same thing with abortion and say, okay, let's not regulate it on a federal level. If Catholics are opposed to abortion, then don't get an abortion, So I think that might be a more honest way of doing things, to look at the process by which they grapple with a really difficult subject like that and come up with a solution that kind of works for everybody, as opposed to cherry picking and saying, hey, let's love your neighbors yourself. Now, the other thing, though, is that the Ammonites and the Moabites and all these there's 7 groups of Canaanites that are supposed to be wiped out and all of that. The Talmud does say they don't exist anymore. This no longer has any bearing on how we look at people. And I think I've mentioned before that, unfortunately, there are some ultra-Orthodox in Israel who use those 7 people, to say that's what the Palestinians are and it's okay to do stuff to them. Even though the Talmud very clearly says, no, this is no longer relevant. But I guess you pick and choose where you're going to focus, right? Any other comments before we go a little further? Okay, so let's go to...
We've seen that, Rabbi, in when I was previously aligned with the fundamentalist community as a Christian. We call it proof texting. You can prove just about anything you want within the within the Hebrew Bible, or even the early Christian scriptures, for that matter.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I think when our former denominations leader said, when you major in the minors, that's when you're getting into trouble.
Yep. Okay, so let's see what we have next. Oops, that's not the right one. Sorry. Wait a minute. All right. And by the way, we know that anybody who's maimed in any way is not allowed to be a priest. But here we have somebody who's got crushed testes, etc. That's really very sad. Okay. All right. Who wants to continue some of this?
I can keep going.
Thank you.
When you are encamped against your enemies, keep away from everything impure. If one of your men is unclean because of a nocturnal emission, he is to go outside the camp and stay there. But as evening approaches, he is to wash himself, and at sunset, he may return to the camp.
So Sandy, you have all the really juicy verses. So by the way, once upon a time in the Bible, it wasn't just women who have their period who have to go to the mikvah. Men who had an emission also had to do that. However, that all kind of seems to have changed by the time it got to the Talmud. Okay.
Designate a place outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. As part of your equipment, have something to dig with. And when you relieve yourself, dig a hole and cover up your excrement. For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy so that he will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you.
Okay, so let me just stop for 1 second. So Carol, are you reading the My Jewish Learning Talmud, the Daf Yomi? Just a couple of days ago,
Yes.
they were talking about what to use to wipe yourself. I mean, these people. So they're talking about shards, and you couldn't use certain kinds of shards, and then they talked about your tushy having teeth in it. Anyway, okay.
Bizarre. It was bizarre.
It was very bizarre. Yeah. Okay. See, the Talmud is much more fun than you might imagine. Okay, keep going, please.
Okay, where was I?
15 here.
If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. No Israelite man or woman is to become a shrine prostitute. You must not bring the earnings of a female prostitute or of a male prostitute into the house of the Lord your God to pay any vow, because the Lord your God detests them both. Do not charge a fellow Israelite interest, whether on money or food or anything else that may earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but not a fellow Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to in the land you are entering to possess. Does that mean that in Israel, the banks can't charge interest?
I don't think they go according to Torah law in Israel.
Okay. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, you will not be guilty. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. If you enter to your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want. Oh my goodness. But do not put any in your basket. If you enter your neighbor's grain yard, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you may not put a sickle to their standing grain.
Thank you.
My
So
goodness.
it says here, charging interest on loans to Gentiles was not a matter of racial or ethnic discrimination. Israelites could not charge each other interest, but Gentiles could and did charge each other. And a foreigner borrowing money from an Israelite would not expect better terms than he would get from one of his own people. I mean, this sounds like a bit of a rationalization, but anyway. In medieval Europe, this freedom to lend at interest combined with exclusion from any respectable trade led to the negative stereotype of the Jew as usurer. So, I mean, that is true that since we're allowed to lend money at interest, and we were forbidden in medieval Europe from being in any kind of trade or owning land or anything, that's what happened. Jews did lend money, and they were then stereotyped as, money grubbing and whatever, Shylock. Let's see. Yeah,
it's interesting because it is actually good for the economics of your society if you allow people to start a business and not have to pay interest on it, and it helps them get a good start. And I actually heard a long time ago that the growth of the Los Angeles Korean community was founded on this principle, where they had a fund to loan to each other so that they could start more businesses and grow their neighborhoods effectively without using the banks. And as a result, people were able to prosper much more quickly in the first generation. So there's actually some very good economic wisdom to this principle if you are really trying to help your own people prosper.
Well, also it says here that where did it go? Charging, no, that's not it. This is the halacha. Even though interest is regularly charged in business, the Torah's ideal of communal solidarity and concern is expressed by Jewish free loan societies in many Jewish communities. So it's an ideal, just like the ideal of the Jubilee year, where the land goes back to the people who owned it, etc. Which
this is a little different. But years ago, we had neighbors when we were living in Tucson that were Mormon, and they were out of work, and the Mormon church took care of them. And when it was all over and he got his job back, they gave him a child to take care of. They said, it's your turn to take, and they gave them like a foster child. That was their responsibility to take care of him.
Well, it really does make sense to be in a community where people take care of each other. On the other hand, it often means adhering to certain community norms that you may not agree with, and being
the Mormon church is very good at taking care of their.
Yeah.
They used to be, I don't know anymore, that they were never on welfare because the church took care of them.
Yeah, they apparently have a huge store of stuff in Salt Lake City, where you would know that, Lynn. Yeah.
They have warehouses.
Yeah.
Full of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I lived in Salt Lake City for a short while back in 1970, and I was bad circumstances, didn't have anything. And a woman that lived there took me to this Bishop's Warehouse, they call it, the local Bishop's Warehouse, giving me a week's worth of food and stuff and diapers because the kids were 6 months old. And, with, not asking anything, just gave it to you.
Wow.
And I wasn't even Mormon.
That's
well,
great.
This Jewish community isn't so bad either.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a nice little community here. That is true. So, by the way, there were cult prostitutes supposedly in the ancient Near East, not Israelite ones, but pagan ones. I'm not sure exactly. I guess you would sleep with one so you could have fertility in your own land as well, or something like that. Kind of do it to ensure that it would happen in your fields. And of course, vows are very important, right? Which is why we have the Kol Nidre service at the beginning of Yom Kippur, where you're allowed to let go of your vows, even though they're supposedly the ones you made to God, not to other people. By the way, this business about being able to go into your neighbor's yard and eat all the, the grapes that you want and the grain and all of that, rabbinic law transformed that into a law about workers, so that not just any old passerby could go in and do that. It was your workers are able to do that as they're working, keep them, sort of like a benefit, instead of health insurance, you get to eat the grain. Apparently, the way these fields were laid out is that people would have to pass through fields that belong to other people. So the idea here is, if you're hungry, you can get some food on your way. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think that's it for this particular chapter. Anybody have any other comments? So as I mentioned in my email, I think we may not be finished next Saturday, so we'll go on to the 13th. I think by then we'll finish this particular Torah portion, which is Kitei Tzei. Now, believe it or not, for those of you who've been on this journey for the last, how many years has it been, Lynn? Wait, you're muted.
You're muted, Lynn. It's a little shy of 40, though.
We started in the fall of 2011.
2011. So it's only been 9 years. Okay, so we're going to be done. We're going to be, okay, chapter 24, which we'll do at least next week, and maybe 25. And then we'll just have very few left. And so maybe by the end of this calendar year, we will have finished. We've been through the entire Torah.
Will it be the same Zoom login?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Lynn.
I can't remember when we started this, when we get to the end of Deuteronomy, what we decided to go on to none. Book. Can't remember.
I mean, I would vote for going on to the book of Joshua. You know,
okay.
If that's what people want to do. Just
I think we talked about it, but I don't remember what.
So long ago, who knows?
Anything. Yeah.
I mean, unless people want to start all over again, but I think it's interesting to go forward and to read some books that, I mean, Joshua and Judges, people don't read very much. Samuel and Kings are often part of the Haftorah, as are, of course, the other prophets. But as I said, Joshua and Judges doesn't get read all that much. Judges is a tough book. Speaking of women. After Deborah, it goes downhill. Hate to tell you, but anyway, maybe we'll never.
We could also read some of that fun Talmud, Rabbi.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? If you read certain passages in the Talmud that have been cherry-picked to be interesting, it's great. I have a partner that I study with every week, and we've been doing a lot of Hasidic texts, but we decided to do some Talmud. And I asked one of my Talmud professors what she would recommend. She recommended Megillah, which is about Purim and Esther and all that. It was so tedious, I cannot begin to tell you. I mean, it just, reading, I mean, oh my God. And even doing this Daf Yomi, sometimes you're going, oh, these people, like, what are they talking about? So, I mean, I've loved Talmud study when someone has picked something really fascinating to read or something intricate, but to read it page by page. And Daf Yomi is not just reading what's in the Talmud, it's also reading the commentaries around it. Like Rashi at least tries to clarify things, but then the Tosafot gets really complicated. So I wouldn't recommend it. We did try to do Talmud. I think it was when, yes, thank you, Randy. I think that Rabbi Yitzi was doing some Talmud, and we were trying to go on, and that was when we were reading some stuff that was like about bestiality. Do you remember that? That was sort of at the end of it. It was about if you are traveling and you stay in an inn that was owned by Goyim, you're not allowed to because you assume that they sleep with their animals. And then there was something about a widow who has a dog, and she can't be too affectionate to the dog because otherwise you assume that, you know, she's had sex with her dog. I mean,
what?
Okay, anyway.
You seem to be suggesting that a bunch of men sitting around in a room, occasionally their minds turned to things that were a little bit twisted.
Yeah. There's a lot of sex in the rabbinic stuff. Anyway, so at 12 o'clock, for those who are interested, we're going to have a Yizkor service. It's a different login, but if you would like to join in a half an hour, that's what we'll be doing.
You mean I have to start from the beginning?
Well, there's another thing to click on. Do you have the login?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did it myself today.
Well, good for you. I'm proud of you.
It was in the same email, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an email reminding people about Torah study and Yizkor, so that.
I'm computer stupid.
No, you're not. Look, you're on Zoom.
That.
That's way more than most people have been able to figure out.
We're impressed, Susie.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll see some of you later. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure, thank you.